Hi, if you're just joining us, I'm Matilda Gregg, the lead organiser for this workshop. This paper is part of a panel called Nationalism and Propaganda, which is essentially concerned with the question of agency. In other words, who has control over the story? Women warriors often make great subjects for news stories, books, or art and workshops because they often seem exceptional, inspirational, attention-grabbing. Over the years, many different governments have realised this and put these stories to use for strategic, diplomatic, or cultural reasons. The videos in this panel explore different examples of this in modern France, Turkey, and China, and also ask how, by contrast, the women at the centre of these stories might be able to exploit their fame for their own devices. Watch on to find out what nail-polished militias might be, and how ideas about motherhood, domesticity, and honour are woven into conversations around female Turkish soldiers today.
Our next speaker is Senem Kaptan. Senem received her PhD in anthropology from Rutgers University in 2018, where she completed a dissertation that analysed the treason and coup trials of military officers in contemporary Turkey. Her work has previously appeared in An Anthropology of Mothering and Militarism, Nationalism and Masculinities in Turkey, among other venues. And she has contributed to the Gender Macmillan Interdisciplinary Handbooks on War, with a chapter entitled Women in the Military. Most recently, Senem was the Women, Peace and Security Programme Fellow at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in New York, where she monitored and reported on United Nations Security Council meetings and conducted advocacy work to advance the WPS agenda and feminist peace. The title of her paper today is Beautiful Warriors or Chaste Patriots: Representation of Women Soldiers in Turkish Media. Thank you very much.
My presentation today will focus on the portrayal of women soldiers in contemporary Turkish media. Specifically, I take a comparative approach in this study and examine the representation of women who serve in the Turkish military vis-à-vis those who serve in militaries abroad. The press coverage of Turkey's women soldiers is a relatively new phenomenon, given that women's presence within the ranks has been intermittent throughout the country's history. Turkey's experience with women in the military dates back to the last years of the Ottoman Empire, where women were admitted into the ranks in short-lived auxiliary units during the First World War. In modern Turkey, which was established in 1923, women were first admitted into military academies for a brief period between the 1950s and 60s, with admission resuming only in the 1990s. It's generally difficult to access official statistics about the overall presence of women in the Turkish military, but recent data suggests that women constitute less than 1% of the ranks. To put this percentage into perspective, in 2013, the most recent year when sex disaggregated data was published by the Turkish Armed Forces on the country's military personnel, there were only a little over 1,300 women soldiers among a total population of nearly 40,000 commissioned officers. So given the immense discrepancy in numbers, with women making up a minuscule percentage of the military ranks, and of course, following the footsteps of feminist scholar Cynthia Enlow, one is tempted to ask, where are the women? In the Turkish case, the answer to this question is mostly at home. To explain what I mean by this, I'll provide a brief overview of the gendered construction of citizenship in Turkey. In the founding years of the Turkish Republic, compulsory military service became one of the primary pillars of the Turkish nation-building project. All able-bodied men were required to enlist. But conscription was not merely seen as a matter pertaining to the defense of the nation. It was portrayed as an integral part of Turkish culture, gendering the notion and practice of citizenship from the country's inception. While men were constructed as dutiful soldiers, women were, for the most part, seen as loyal wives and patriotic mothers who would raise citizen soldiers. Women's general absence from the Turkish military institution is therefore not by accident, but rather by design. Gender norms, societal ideas about how men and women should behave in a given context have played a heavy role in this very conscious construction of military culture in Turkey. Today, women have a broader presence within Turkey's militarized state order in their official capacity as soldiers. Even though their numbers don't add up to much, statistically speaking, women soldiers hold an important place for nationalist propaganda, particularly in light of Turkey's ongoing Kurdish conflict that has claimed thousands of lives to this date. In the current moment, women in the Turkish military serve in special forces units, are deployed in overseas operations, and hold active leadership positions. As I mentioned earlier, gender norms at any given moment have a major impact in delimiting the roles men and women have in a particular society. In the eloquent words of anthropologist Ayşegül Altınay, all nationalist projects involve a remaking of femininities and masculinities with an ambivalent set of opportunities and restrictions for both. There's perhaps no better demonstration of this statement other than the great irony that has marked women's conscious exclusion from the military realm in Turkey, and that is the fact that the country prides itself on producing the world's first woman combat pilot, Sabiha Gökçen. Yet, as Ayşegül Altınay has so insightfully shown us, Gökçen's short-lived military career was steeped in gendered obstacles. Perhaps most illuminating is the fact that Gökçen was sent to her combat mission upon being handed a gun with the duty to protect her honor, which in this case meant to kill herself if she were to get captured. Ideals about honor, which usually manifest themselves as seeing women's bodies as a threat that needs to be managed, strongly shaped women's experiences with the military institution in Turkey. The auxiliary units of the First World War and the Ottoman military are a case in point. Women were offered these positions within the military institution not merely to compensate for the declining numbers of men in the labor force, but also to help them make a living through quote-unquote honorable means during difficult wartime conditions. The biased selection of candidates for these positions is evident in the way applicants were solicited, seeking women and allowing them in the ranks only upon proof that they were, and I quote, virtuous, well-behaved, and chaste. The one contemporary Turkish news article that I could find on these units was marked by a sense of surprise by the requirements of chastity and honor for a military position. So looking at women's expanded roles within the Turkish military today, one might assume that this change is the result of a gradual shift in gender norms and perceptions. We are, after all, approaching the centennial of the Republic. Turning our attention to contemporary media portrayals of women in the Turkish military provides a different picture, however. News about women soldiers in Turkish media, print and visual alike, are few and far between. When coverage does appear, it usually happens to be on the same story, repackaged across different media outlets in very similar ways. Regardless of the date, location, or people profiled, the content of these stories is surprisingly consistent, always written with a gendered undertone. And I'll explain with two examples. A news article from 2017 profiled women soldiers in Kars, a city bordering Armenia in Turkey's northeast. The article focuses specifically on the roles and life stories of two women soldiers, peppered with praise for their difficult work and tenacity to overcome hardships. Introducing the first profiled officer, however, the very first sentence reads, "This lieutenant both serves as a mother to her children and keeps the brigade's vehicles, arms, and ammunition ready for duty." A different newspaper that profiled the same women soldiers doesn't even feel the need to wait until the first sentence to remind us of the soldier's gender. The headline of this article reads, "The women commanders of the Turkish armed forces, perfect shooters and mothers at once." The role of motherhood is emphasized time and again in news coverage across media outlets, but especially in articles that profile women soldiers. In a 2016 interview with the first woman fleet commander of the Turkish armed forces, interspersed among questions about her illustrious career, this woman soldier bluntly gets asked, Who takes care of your children while you're gone? And then the interviewer probes further. You have 2 small children. Do they ever tell you, Mom, don't go to work, don't fly? In Turkish media narratives, it looks like women soldiers are mothers first and soldiers second. Perhaps inadvertently, this interview ends with a rather pertinent quote to the fleet commander that gets to the heart of the matter. And I quote, "Do you feel like a woman, a soldier, or a woman soldier?" To which she responds, "Flying, being a pilot, and being a soldier has become a lifestyle for me. I'm a soldier, that's all I can say." As these examples demonstrate, women soldiers' representation in the Turkish media carry a gendered undertone that blends patriotism with domesticity, rather similar to early Republican citizenship ideals. As political scientist Ayşe Kadıoğlu skillfully expresses, and I quote, "The new woman of the Republic was a modest, asexual comrade in arms. She was first and foremost a loyal wife and mother," end of quote. In a similar manner, women soldiers in contemporary Turkey are portrayed in the media as patriotic heroines who serve the nation through their role in the military, with the reader and perhaps the soldiers themselves always being reminded that their true duty is to their house and domestic chores. Perhaps the best example of this is the most recent news coverage of the Turkish military being mobilized to help those in need as part of the measures on COVID-19. Highlighting women soldiers' role in this mobilization effort, a news article from April 2020 appeared with the following headline: "Heartwarming scenes to behold. Women soldiers knead dough and bake bread." The Turkish media representation of women soldiers serving in militaries abroad is rather different than that of their Turkish counterparts. This representation appears under 3 broad categories. First, there are news reports that focus on sexual harassment, often conveying these incidents as shocking revelations within military institutions, as if they were stories foreign to the Turkish national realm. Then there's news coverage about women's incorporation into special forces units, sometimes accompanied with underlying messages and assumptions of how women aren't qualified to be undertaking such training. Finally, there are news stories, also the most frequently encountered, that highlight women soldiers' sexuality. Common among this last strand of hypersexualized representation are news on how women soldiers have, quote-unquote, stirred up social media with their risque posts. Here, newspapers juxtapose photos of women soldiers in uniform with their sometimes semi-nude civilian images taken from social media. In these stories, women soldiers are often described as brave, beautiful, and breathtaking, and portrayed akin to action heroines, dangerous and seductive at once. As another example, one news article from 2016 profiled Ukrainian paramilitary forces with the headline, "Nail-polished militias fighting against Russia." The article went on to detail the women militias' lives with the following words, and I quote, "The warrior women here are rather well groomed. Even though they spend their days in military tents, they don't give up on their blow dries or nail polish." End of quote. Ironically, the photos that appeared in the article don't include either blow-dried hair or polished nails. Sexuality this time is just implied rather than demonstrated. As I mentioned earlier, in the news coverage of Turkish women soldiers, women's gender identities are always tied to motherhood and domesticity, and women are portrayed more as asexual comrades. When sexuality comes up, it is through the notion of honor, which appears as a virtue that needs to be protected from foreign bodies. By contrast, the sexuality underlying the coverage of women soldiers serving in militaries abroad always appears as a seduction or threat. For instance, in a 2013 newspaper article that focused on the NATO Patriot mission, which brought foreign militaries to Turkey, it was stated that the Turkish male soldiers were given the following orders as they worked with their foreign counterparts, and I quote, Be careful about your interactions with German women soldiers. Be hospitable, but don't fool around and don't get too intimate. End of quote. The news also dubbed this as the Helga warning, alluding to the commonly used name in Turkey to refer to German women, sometimes in a hypersexualized way. So why do these representations matter? I would like to reflect on this question by going back to the insightful remarks of the feminist anti-militarist scholar Cynthia Enloe. In her thought-provoking book, Maneuvers, which details the global militarization of women's lives, Enloe states that constructing ideals of masculine behavior in any culture cannot be accomplished without considering ideals of femininity that are supportive and complementary. As the Turkish example well demonstrates, women soldiers' representation in the media is a reflection of a given society's gender norms. These norms, in turn, have a direct impact on women's experiences within military institutions, which still largely remain male-dominated and masculine spaces. Turkish women are now celebrated in their role as soldiers in the media, but always with the underlying assumption and message that they're first and foremost mothers. Simply put, a male soldier, Turkish or otherwise, would never be asked who takes care of his children while he's on a combat mission, or whether or not his profession gets in the way of him keeping his house clean and orderly. Gender stereotypes and norms that are attached to women also ruthlessly tarnish women soldiers' professional reputations and impede their progress within the ranks. This is evident in the double standard that almost always manifests itself in the coverage of women soldiers across the media. One Turkish news article from 2013 covering Australia's lifting of frontline combat duty restrictions for women, with only few applications received from them, announced this development with the following headline: "Women find frontline combat too difficult." Ironically, there's nothing in the article that explains why women have not applied for these positions, but the author of the piece presupposes that the reason is, of course, women's inability to endure the hardships of combat. I'd like to end my presentation by reflecting on the words of a Turkish woman Navy officer who explains what it means to be a soldier. She says, and I quote, "Being a Turkish woman has placed heavier and graver responsibilities on our shoulders than simply being a woman," end of quote. There's perhaps no better demonstration of this statement than the 2009 International Women's Day poster, one among many prepared that year by the Turkish Armed Forces. The poster has a quote from Atatürk, the country's founding father, which reads, "Our women must be wiser, more productive, and more knowledgeable than men." Presumably stated to encourage women's role in the Turkish nation-building process, this quote is ironically also a reflection of the impossible standards women are continually held to. As my analysis of media portrayals of women soldiers has hopefully shown, women are always doomed to be doing either too much or too little, but it seems like they can never be quite enough. Thank you.
Thanks so much for watching this talk, which was part of the Nationalism and Propaganda panel. If you haven't already, make sure to go check out the other two talks in this panel by clicking the links on screen now.